You are listening to the Novel Writing Podcast, episode 156. I'm your host, Colleen Mitchell. Grab a cup, cozy up, and let's get to writing. Today's episode is the next in our Literary Sins series, all about those things authors do, or don't do, that drive readers nuts, and how to avoid them, or not. This literary sin is about having too many characters, both in total and introduced at one time. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have a large cast of characters, but you will lose readers if you don't take the proper time and care with introducing them. Books with large casts are becoming more of the norm, especially in fantasy and in series books, regardless of genre. But just because it's becoming more popular doesn't mean you have to have a large cast. I once read a fantasy book that introduced almost the entire cast in the space of one scene, and that one scene took place at a long dining table, sort of like the house tables in Harry Potter. I couldn't keep the characters straight. I didn't remember their names or any of their unique qualities or their magical abilities, and I never connected with any of them long enough to care about what happened to them later on. That book probably could have cut down on those characters by half, or introduced them all in different settings that made them much more memorable. In my first book, there's a scene where my main characters walk down into Camelot and meet 3 secondary characters just outside the front gate. Early versions of this scene had all 3 secondary characters being introduced at the same time, which Haley pointed out was not memorable, even with just 3 characters. And she had a good point, too. So during edits, we changed it so that each character is introduced one at a time, usually in one paragraph at a time, in memorable ways, and this was still just outside the Camelot gate, in the same scene. But the way we did it made it so that the reader connected with each of those characters and could remember things about them. And I ended up doing the same type of thing with introducing future characters as well. Doing this for a large cast can be time-consuming and difficult, which is in itself a case for a smaller cast, but what do you do if your story necessitates a large cast? First, I'd really question if you do, in fact, need a large cast. Get really clear on the role of each character and why they are necessary to the plot. If you take them out, or combine them with another character, what do you lose, if anything? I combined 2 characters from my first drafts of book 1 into a single character. This ended up being Renault Lefay, who actually became one of my most favorite characters because he got the qualities of both previous characters, and it made him a much more dynamic, interesting character than either of his predecessors were on their own. When you have multiple characters fulfilling the same or similar roles in the story, you will probably need to axe one of them or combine them. And second, if you do really need a large cast, and the number of characters in a large cast will change depending on your genre, figure out how to introduce them all slowly, and in such a way that the reader won't forget that character. If a reader forgets a character, it's a sign that the character is not super important and raises the question again of whether that character is really necessary. As a side note, if you have side characters who are basically extras in a scene that might be mentioned once and then never again, you can still make them memorable if you want, but you don't need to build up a huge backstory from them all, and you don't need to be as concerned with introducing these characters as you do for characters that are more important to your story. There's a really brief scene in my first book with 2 named characters who are never seen again, but their presence in that particular scene was extremely important for the overall plot. A related no-no to this literary sin is having too many characters with similar sounding names or names that start with the same letter. Now, I fully admit that I am guilty of this sin because I have way too many characters in my books that start with the letter A, and I accidentally introduced a new character in book 3 that also has an A name, but I actually can't change it because the name itself is important to the story. So when you're thinking about character names, do what you can to have a little bit of variety to make them more memorable. A good example of this problem is actually the Game of Thrones books. There's a character named Osha, O-S-H-A, who is a wildling from the north, and Asha, A-S-H-A, who is basically a warrior princess of the Iron Islands. Those names are only distinguished by the leading vowel, and when you say the names out loud, they're incredibly similar depending on how you pronounce them. Osha, like the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, or Asha, A-W-E-S-H-A, like you are in awe, Asha, versus the other character, who could also be pronounced Asha, A-S-H-A, or Asha. So in my head, the way I pronounce these 2 characters when I'm reading the books is Osha and Asha, because that clearly separated them in my mind. But you could have readers who are pronouncing those 2 characters the exact same way, because you can pronounce both characters Asha, and it would be correct. So you can tell how confusing this is already, even if you've never read the books. The TV show solved this problem by renaming the warrior princess Asha to Yara. While the move made a lot of the book fans mad, it actually was a good move in terms of not confusing the TV audience as to which character was which when you can't read their names on the page, only hear them pronounced in the show. Large casts can cause problems not just with memorability for the reader, but also for the author. Did you forget about a character or characters introduced early on who seemed like they were going to play important roles and then never came up again? It's kind of like making sure you're tracking important artifacts or animals throughout the story. A lot of pets brought up in the first few chapters of a book can end up forgotten by the middle and the end, leaving readers wondering what happened to them. The same problem with introducing a large cast happens when you have a lot of creatures or other things that you want the reader to know, because as authors, we all want our readers to be as involved in the lore as we are. But if you introduce them all at the same time, or in close succession, or they're not easily distinguished from one another, the reader will get lost. In the same book that introduced a lot of characters at the huge dinner table, the author also had a huge list of fantasy creatures with subtle differences, difficult names in terms of pronunciation and variability, and info-dumped them on the reader in the space of just a couple of chapters. The author could have fixed this problem by whittling the creatures down to just a few of the most important ones of the story, and introducing them in a lot more memorable ways than a history lesson for the main character. Now, a lot of these problems are solved through critique, self-edits, professional edits, and alpha and beta readers. You don't necessarily have to stress about avoiding a large cast or info dumping in the first draft. Just be aware that if you do have a bunch of characters, that you might have to sacrifice some of them in service of the story, so that you don't lose the reader. If you're struggling with figuring out how to get rid of this literary sin in your writing, one of the first steps is to give your characters unique voices. You can practice this skill with our 5-day character development challenge, which you can find at tallyink.com. That's TALLYINK.com. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for joining me, and remember, the first draft is supposed to be garbage. Thanks for listening to the Novel Writing Podcast. If you're ready to stop struggling and start finishing your novel, check out the 60-Day Novel Writing Challenge. It's a step-by-step program designed for solo writers to complete their first draft with clarity and focus. Visit the link in the description to learn more.